Good evening, Venice. Good evening, world. Welcome to the Meetings on Architecture session dedicated tonight to the Future Assembly special exhibition within the Biennale, which has been designed by Sebastian Behmann, Studio Other Spaces, and Olafur Eliasson, collaborating for this occasion with Professor Caroline Jones of Art History at MIT, who's with us on the stage tonight, along with Sebastian, and with Hadid Ibrahim, activist, Kumi Naidoo, Ambassador for Africans Rising for Justice, Peace and Dignity, Mariana Mazzucato, Professor and Founding Director of the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose at the University College of London, Mary Robinson, Chair of the Elders and Adjunct Professor of Climate Justice at Trinity College in Dublin, Paola Antonelli, Senior Curator of Architecture and Design at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Let me say a few words about Studio Other Spaces, or SOS. SOS was founded by artist Olafur Eliasson and architect Sebastian Behmann in Berlin in 2014. The studio connects architecture and art through interdisciplinary and experimental building projects and artworks for public space. The recent projects include the design of List Restaurant in Fele Vordenhuis, Common Sky, a contribution to the invention of the Albright Knox Art Gallery in Buffalo, New York, a permanent work of art for the 15th and 16th floor of the Moreland Mixité Capitale building in Paris, and the Meles Zenawi Memorial Park in Addis Ababa, a campus comprising of 5 buildings, 7 pavilions, and a park conceived and built with Ethiopian partners and in collaboration with Vogt Landscape Architects. The studio's first solo exhibition, titled The Design of Collaboration, was on display at Kunst Merano Art in South Tyrol, Italy, from September 2020 through January 2021. Tonight, we will be joined on stage, as I mentioned, by both Sebastian and Caroline, online by Olafur Eliasson, also Liz McTurnan from the team of SOS Studio, and by Kumi Naidoo, and possibly, if the stars align, with Mariana Mazzucato. What I would like to do first is explain to you the background of what led us to this special installation, and I will turn to Sebastian to explain the setup, how it came about through Studio Other Spaces, and then to Caroline to comment on the whole process, having been one of the 6 co-designers involved in this project. If you remember, this Biennale was actually supposed to happen in 2020. And if you remember, 2020 was also the year that the United Nations celebrated its 75th anniversary. With a theme like How Will We Live Together, I could not but notice the contrast that existed, especially in the grounds of the Giardini, between the grounds set up around the idea of national pavilions and the theme that invites everybody to live together. The structure of a Biennale is obviously a historical one that we've inherited from the 19th century, but that lurks on, continues on in some form or the other. And given that there were 5 scales of addressing the question of how will we live together, I thought first that putting the 2 larger scales across territories, across borders, and as one planet in the Giardini's main pavilion in the middle among the different national pavilions would help present to the world, through this exhibition, an alternative structure. But I also felt like maybe, given the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, we could also have a pavilion for the United Nations, and sought through the good mediation of Hadid Ibrahim and Mary Robinson to talk to Amina Mohammed, the Deputy General Secretary of the United Nations in New York, who herself is very much a strong proponent of bringing arts and culture into the sphere of the UN and its exposure, particularly during the celebration anniversary of the 75th year, but also in promoting the sustainability principles of the United Nations through these kinds of venues. Over a series of lunches and dinners we had there, it was seen, especially during a very important dinner with Olafur, Hadid, Amina, and myself, that maybe if we are to make it officially the United Nations Pavilion, it would have to go through the General Assembly for a vote. And maybe we will be able to find a solution in the 100th anniversary celebration. So we might as well come up with a very different approach to this. What was important that helped save this discussion was that Mary Robinson volunteered to be part of this, both being affiliate with the United Nations, but also to help us think through this question in general. When I first shared the theme with Mary, how will we live together, she immediately responded, being very much invested in climate justice. She said, the only way we can live is if we live together. And therefore, transcending the format of the UN as nation states coming together, but each maintaining their nationhood in order to come up with terms of common living, was very central to her thinking about climate justice. And we turned to her, and Olafur and Hadil and her, then under the blessings of Amina, formed a collective group of 6 co-designers, which included Kumi, Mariana, and Paola Antonelli as well. And over a series of Zooms, first before the pandemic and then after the pandemic, between Iceland, London, Boston, Beirut, New York, a kind of new formulation came up, which I thought was much, much better than just having yet another pavilion in the middle. We immediately created a space for it, which is on the mezzanine platform on the end of the central axis for the Giardini. But to get there, we had to build a new staircase, because the old staircase, which was Carlos Scarpa's staircase, had been removed a while back. And the Carlos Scarpa staircase had a difficulty navigating because it included steps of exhibition spaces along the way. I had to deal with the specter of Carlos Scarpa in redesigning this approach. And also I had to deal with how does one maintain this direct access without creating a monumental axiality. And I hope that the stair that you went up addresses both problems while paying homage a little bit to Carlos Scarpa. So I now turn to Sebastian to explain to us how SOS came to the rescue.
Thank you, Hashim. Thank you for the introduction. So this is, I think, very helpful to understand how we came actually to be in the Central Pavilion with the topic of the UN. And when we discussed the topic within the larger team, it was pretty clear that we need to talk about the we in the how do we live together. So who are we? And we need to extend this question then to all the more than humans, which was actually the central discussion we had in the very beginning of the of designing the pavilion. Another really important topic was the how. How do we do this? How can we kind of find a future representation for the UN? And we did a long research, and this we can also find in the pavilion's layout. We will get to this a little later. And this research actually brought us to the fact that, since the founding of the UN in 1949, lots have been done to improve the situations of humans in terms of the crisis that need to be tackled after the Second World War. But some things, but not enough, had been done on climate justice on the behalf of actually bringing nature a voice and bringing nature actually into the situation that they have a court. There are, in fact, situations that we actually posted out on the external walls. We will get back to this later. But our feeling was this was not enough. So we wanted to center our design on the behalf of stakeholders who need to have a voice at the table at the future UN. So we formed this idea of the Future Assembly, which basically means a new beginning after the 75 years of the UN into the future. So what will be the next 75 years? It was very clear that we needed representatives for the pavilion. And we call them stakeholders. So these are basically non-human representatives. This could be a mountain, a river, an object, a situation, a bridge, all of what connects us humans with the rest of the world. And we ask us, how can we kind of really get a kind of globally stretched mixture of stakeholders that can actually be represented on the Biennale? Because another topic to us was always, we don't want to spend flights, we don't want to travel as much as has been done in the past of the Biennale. So we needed to do a Biennale that is somehow local but international at the same time without shipping huge amounts of goods around the world. So there was this brilliant idea from you actually to ask the participants who already participate in the Biennale to pick the stakeholders for the show of the Future Assembly. And this we did. We approached them with a letter, with a questionnaire, and that was about pick somebody, something, a situation, a stakeholder that should have a table at the future UN, and try to find a representation for that stakeholders that we can actually show in Venice in the central pavilion. 50 officers picked up on that idea, and I think we can see that here. I will guide you a little bit through the design now of the pavilion. You can see the outer wall. I mean, maybe to say before, one really nice thing about that space is that, Hashim, you took off the kind of cladding from the skylight, so we actually have daylight in the pavilion, and we use that daylight to kind of make that side walls more visible and more present, and we used the wall then to actually present a timeline. Elizabeth, who will then after me also get in more details about the timeline, will explain more about it. But you can see that on the framing walls there is a kind of 75 years history of attempts from the UN, but also many other institutions, private pieces, books, artists who actually try to voice the nature or to give nature a standing, court cases, all of these kind of things. And on the inside, I flip around here, we placed a 12-meter diameter carpet. That is a design from Studio Other Spaces where we actually thought about representations of our world. How can we bring the world as a whole into the show as, the thing that actually kind of makes the whole thing spin? And our idea was to design a new map. You can see that it's seen from the north, as the classical UN map is also. But rather than political borders or geographical marks that make really sense to humans, we try to focus on other principles such as ocean currents, salinity, the temperature, but not the temperature, but the temperature differences. So how much did temperature rise, and the dynamics on that planet that doesn't really matter maybe so much for the humans, but a lot for the non-humans. So we were trying to imagine a non-human a map, and this is basically the matrix on the ground where we hang from all the stakeholders that were actually brought by the participants. And in addition to that, you can see that here on the corner we had a kind of mirror box on the inside, and this mirror box kind of endlessly reflects then the entries. Some of the stakeholders are presented by objects, some by films, some by sounds. We group them into different topics, and we try to have a dynamic display that somehow should not be static, but a lively situation, so that you could almost imagine to step into a debate at the Future Assembly, where you as a human are barely kind of understanding what the discussion is about, because it might be between a river and a mountain and some other stakeholders. So you also feel slightly alienated in that space. That is actually by purpose, because it's not about us alone. It's really about us in relation to the other stakeholders. You can see how they relate to each other. On the wall, you can find cases of rivers who got or granted rights, and on the inside, you can actually find rivers who were picked by stakeholders, such as the Rio de la Plata, for example, in a wonderful film, or pieces like the Earth crust demanding back the CO2, also as a movie on the inside. And then you find similar events or artworks on the pinboard on the timeline. So they should just frame what we actually picked as the stakeholders, and they should just give them more meaning and more background, because it might sound utopic or completely out of the question that a river get certain rights to actually go with a representative to court. But this had happened in many cases in New Zealand, in India, in Bangladesh. So it's not something that is so utopic. It's actually happening. And to see the entries that we have, it's about 30 on the wall, 300 on the wall. We could have picked also 10,000. So there are many more, and there are many more coming. So we see the whole thing as a movement, and really we want to encourage the UN to pick up on that topic more seriously in the future. So in that sense, the Future Assembly Pavilion came together as a whole, as a vision for the future, but also a reflection on the work of the UN of the last 75 years. So this as a small introduction. I would like to hand over to Liz now. She will guide you through the timeline in more detail.
Hello. Hi. I'm just going to present really briefly the main points from our, not only covering the timeline, but also our framing text, which conceptualizes the project and grounds it in the bigger ideas. I guess the starting premise is that if we're going to design and imagine possible futures, then we have to do it while including and imagining more than human perspectives. And for us, it was important to make a distinction between the definition of the more than human and simply the non-human. The more than human is something that it includes and transcends the human, while the non-human is a little bit more defined by negation, what is not us. And in that sense, the example that Sebastian gave of a river system and a river system gaining personhood is kind of a perfect example, because a river system doesn't have clear boundaries, and its identity is sort of defined by the different perspectives that live in it, whether it's human or non-human species or ecologies. And so the more than human is really a situation more than an entity, and more about emphasizing relations and not separateness. And with that also comes this opportunity to expand our notion of we, and what we includes, as Sebastian also touched on, and especially in a sort of collaborative frame in the exhibition, where participants are sort of defined by their nationhood or what country they come from, how to do a project starting from SOS and then build out to our collaborators and the biennial participants who were invited to offer stakeholders, and to just expand and swell and have a more robust sense of this we, while knowing it can never be finished in a way. Another way to address the more than human is in our timeline, which is sort of our offering of a parallel history of the last 75 years. So the UN Charter, which is generally human-centric, was established in 1945. So we looked at charting out the history of legislation, movements, policies that have secured or at least amplified the ideas of an awareness of the rights of the more than human. And again, the river system is a good example. And also to say that this could be just a collection of successes and we can pat ourselves on the back, but we also included the many moments where that policymaking was undone, like the Ganges gaining personhood and then having it taken away 3 months later by another legislative process. So just, it's also important as a sort of, to keep us active in our relationship to this history, that it has its own fragility. Governments are fragile, political will is fragile. And I would say that, as Sebastian suggested, this project is sort of by definition incomplete. So the we is never finished, the timeline is never finished, the stakeholders abound, and there are limitations within the project, such as it being in English. So we have to also acknowledge that even the we that we're working within is sort of limited by our perspectives, and that's why it's important to include more and more voices. And yeah, I would say this is a project that we ask ourselves, we see the last 75 years and we ask ourselves, what do the next 75 years look like? And how can we imagine ourselves identify ourselves into a more futureful vision of the world? And so I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you.
I am waiting for the cockpit to tell me, is Olafur on?
Yes, Olafur is on, and Kumi is next to me.
And then we want you both to step in and hello.
Can you hear us?
We can see you, we can hear you.
Oh, I apologize for the Catholic Church. They're ringing in the background, in case you can't hear it. It's really loud here, so I was a little confused for some.
We could hear, but we couldn't tell it was Catholic.
Okay, good. But it's Roman Catholic. So thank you for having us and for the great introduction. I'm so proud to be a part of this project. When I heard Sebastian talking, evidently it was an opportunity to relive it. And I was reminded about all these questions that to a large extent are open-ended. And so the project, as I think also Liz just said so great, it really hosts a journey. And it is one of these projects that the goal, how should you say, once you start the journey, you have arrived at the goal. At the goal, or the goal, that's a goal. Now I can see Kumi on the screen, which is great. And I just wonder, Hashim, I think we heard a great introduction about the piece, and I was curious to hear, as I was working so closely with the team and Sebastian here, I was so excited to see Caroline Jones on stage, meaning that you have the luxury of having a few more people analog as digital, but how can I best contribute to the agenda that is so beautifully unfolded instead of confusing it like I am now?
From the order that, since you and Liz were there, that you would be speaking, but I can happily turn back to Caroline to ask for her intervention, and then maybe open it up to you too for coming back and giving some feedback. Okay.
Absolutely.
Caroline, it's all yours.
It's wonderful to see the remote people and the real people. And there was something nice flying around on the stage earlier, and I thought that was also lovely to welcome. I was overjoyed to be part of this process and to have this kind of community to think with, and the challenge of representing the more than human. And I think my, is it okay, Kumi? Can you hear from here? Yeah? Okay. I think my obsession that I contributed to the group was around symbiosis, which is a biological concept which simply means with living. And I think the challenge is to move us from a very dominant set of philosophies about the individual, which is magnified to man, you know, the anthropos, to recognize that that has never really been accurate, right? Essentially, all of existentialism was wrong. We are not born alone. We do not die alone. We are recycled into the earth by our bacteria and the fungi on our skin. And that is something we need to recognize. And until we can recognize that, we will jeopardize the future assembly. I mean, you know, we're in the path of and largely responsible for the 6th greatest extinction. And so if there is to be a future assembly, right, we need to radically change. So for me, symbiosis is a very powerful corrective. I just arrived in Venice today and just saw the Future Assembly for the first time in person. So my feelings are very fresh, but I was quite moved by it, particularly by the timeline, so I really appreciated that. And I think I would just simply like to end with a little story about lichens. So the first biological theorizing of symbiosis came out of lichenology. There was a whole little branch studying lichens because they were quite perplexing and confusing entities. Finally, the way that science proves things is often by isolating them. And here, as an art historian, I think of that beautiful Albrecht Dürer drawing of a hare, right? Completely isolated on this beautiful white background, right? This is a kind of proto-scientific method that you take the entity out of the context in order to isolate and understand its functionality. But the lichenologists had a big problem doing that because A, the lichen could never be created in the lab, could never be created in isolation, and B, they ultimately were able to separate two completely separate entities who constituted the lichen, namely an algae and a fungus. So if you think about it, this is a primordial architecture. The algae is that which masters the act of photosynthesis, structureless, usually floating around in the ocean in mats, of photosynthesizing green. And the fungus figured out structure. The fungus figured out how to attach the algae to the side of a rotting tree, how to push up into space, how to give it this kind of architectonic structure. So for me, the algae and the fungus together as absolutely inseparable symbionts could be the mascot of the Future Assembly. So I quote a wonderful developmental biologist, Scott Gilbert, who ends a very famous essay of his with the phrase, "We are all lichens." So that would be my provocation.
Olafur, Kumi, we turn to you. Any additional comments about and reflections on your experience in being part of this?
Yes, thank you very much. Caroline, thank you. And Sebastian, thank you for those comments. I want to talk about this design effort and how it sits in the context of the world at the moment. And I think we need to recognize that we live in the most consequential decade in humanity's history. What we achieve in the next 10 years is going to determine what kind of future we have. And I don't think it's too dramatic to say whether we will have a future at all. And part of the design of this Future Assembly was to send a message in a way that nature does not negotiate. We cannot change the science of where humanity has driven the planet to as a result of our relentless war on nature. And all we have in our capability to do is to change our ideas around how we govern the planet and how we actually find a way to mutually coexist with nature for hopefully centuries to come. And I think the point to make here is that oftentimes you will hear many people say, including people like myself, save the planet. Sometimes save the climate, save the environment. But save the planet is, a very popular refrain. At one level, we could actually say that the planet actually does not need saving. That actually, if we continue on the suicidal trajectory that we are on, the end result will be, we will be gone, but the planet will still be here. And truth be said, if that sixth extinction that Caroline talked about happens in its entirety, the forests will recover, the oceans will replenish, and so on. So in the design of a future way of thinking about the networked world that we live in, we are looking at a challenge of how humanity can fundamentally coexist with nature. And if we do not crack that, then humanity goes And yes, some species will go together with us, but actually the biggest losers in all of this will be humanity, and nature will have a capability to replenish itself. And so I end by saying that this work happens at a moment of extreme planetary urgency, and I think it is pushing the bounds of thinking, and for that I think it's a very valuable exercise.
Interesting, Kumi. We were enjoying the discussions at great length, as there were so different capacities. As you can hear, Kumi is utterly inspiring, and as he started saying about the design process, and now of course it was the team's role to pick out the design elements of what he just said, and which is very easy, as you can imagine, because it often is led by questions that we take for granted, like we take interhuman, like multilateralism. We take it for granted, as of course everyone can talk to everyone, and then you realize in order to design something that has the hospitality or inclusion and not drive embedded structural agendas is actually not so easy design-wise. And how do you then actually create a design that reflects the values we're talking about when the values are not actually fully rolled out yet? And of course, fundamentally, it's always interesting and it makes you feel very good because you appear a little bit smarter than 75 years ago, standing on the shoulders of the traumatization of the Second World War. UN was finally founded as a multilateral systems, and it reached out to somehow create some common ground on, three human rights issues, right? And the interesting thing, the fundamental human rights, they are not bad. You can always probably find a way to sort of make them better, but it as a document, I always recommend people to have a look at it because it's very easy to read. There's a short version on UN's homepage, because it's actually very interesting because it's the things we take for granted. And once you read it, you realize that's not how it is everywhere, and certainly not at all. And in the same sense, multilateralism and I would take that into sort of more than human or beyond human, and all the amazing and incredible work done by theoreticians like Timothy Morton or peeked into more applied like Donna Haraway. It's like the kind of triple O's or new materialism in the sense that suddenly we are as humans capable of acknowledging that we have been blind. In our privileges, we've been blinded by ourselves. And for some reason, when human rights was founded 75 years ago, they took it for granted that these oceans are going to be okay. They took it for granted that the air is going to be breathable and that all the species will flourish and so on and so forth, because there was this idea that nature was external. It was outside of us and so on. And of course, we know it's all different, thanks to, for instance, Donna Haraway or the biologist Lynn Margulis, who I think, Caroline, might have been a friend of Scott that you just quoted, or maybe not. But Lynn Margulis she says, we need to be freed from our species-specific arrogance. And she uses that term often as a kind of reference to human exceptionalism. We humans are like so unbelievably exceptional, which is, of course, the lie, as we're messing up everything. In fact, human beings are upright mammalian weeds. I think it's a fantastic quote by Lynn Margulis. And this is somehow, as to your great invitation, Hashim, and what was the title of the Biennale? How do we live together? We asked, how do we live together with every single rock, every single water, every single fish in the ocean? And it's been such a great opportunity to realize that we have also been blind, we have also been wrong, and all these people who are working in each sectors, all these stones and animals and projects and situations, to work with this kind of completely different way of thinking. I'm really grateful for your invitation, Hashim, creating this opportunity. And I just not need to credit one person who at the very table, and you mentioned Hadil Ibrahim, my partner, it was actually her idea to go right at Amina Mohammed at the UN. So let's say the seed out of which all of this grew was from Hadil.
Well, thank you very much. And actually, one of the secret motivations behind creating this event was to replay the intensity of those discussions and the amazing intellectual energy that was there at the discussions with you and Hadil and with Amina, but also on the phone with the group. And I hope the audience catches a bit of that. I wanted to ask Houston if Mariana Mazzucato is joining us. Is it a yes or a no? No. No, okay. So it's going to be among the five of us. We few, happy few. Thank you so much. I actually had a few questions just to warm us up, hoping that the audience will step in also to ask as well. Yeah, and I think I can go back to some of the questions that we were ourselves dealing with in shaping this discussion itself, but also in framing the theme of the Biennale. One has to do with a very, very difficult but almost necessary challenge to actually imagine how do we project architecture and its role in the post-Anthropocene. And I would like to link it to many things that you all said, which have to do with identifying a non-anthropocentric perspective. The paradox of that is even imagining a non-anthropocentric perspective is itself anthropocentric. And architecture has that problem, which, I mean, to quote from everybody, we are condemned almost in the way the field is framed to project the species-specific arrogance which architecture represents. Because if anything, it is about a shelter that protects us from the elements, from nature, from other species, from the algae and the fungi that exist, at least outside us, not inside us. So it seems to me that if we are to accelerate the response to the climate challenge, as Kumi put it in front of us as being a very urgent one, how do we begin to create this new epistemology within architecture that allows us to move forward with this non-anthropocentric perspective framed within our discipline, within our profession? You represent the profession here, Sebastian.
Yes, I'm the only architect in the team here. I think it's an extremely difficult question to ask in this context here, but of course, as we came up with the Future Assembly, we should also, come up with some ideas and some trajectories, because for me personally, it was a 2-year journey of really questioning profoundly the base of my profession, also personally. I think we should all do that, by the way. It's the point to do that, and it's really difficult since actually we worked on that project to kind of come up with a trajectory for our designs. And I think Olafur touched that point before. So how to design something which is in process where we actually have to admit we did mistakes, fundamental mistakes in understanding not exactly what needs to be done. So I have a few projects that we actually started now, and they had to do with education. And I think one thing we can do and we should do is to really forget lots about what we learned as architects about our profession and how to actually design a process, because this is what is taught at the university. And we really have to start from the beginning and start with a different foundation to understand how can we see the world out there in a different perspective. How can we see the world out there as a mind, as a spirit, as something that really talks to us rather than something that we have to control. And I think a lot of our thinking in the profession is based on controlling nature, kind of ruling nature, and that has a long history, and that history we simply have to cut more or less immediately. That's my proposal. With not doing that, we will always kind of weave the same mistakes from the past, And dominating nature is, you know, we can also find this in humanities. You know, it's also about political structures, it's about colonialistic structures, it's about gender structures, you know, all of that somehow plays in the same direction, so we cannot ignore it anymore. I think that's the point. So education is one thing I think is important to start, and another thing is that we also have to kind of end this battle between whether the technology or the individuals need to solve the problem, or if the politicians and the kind of heuristic aspect of it should kind of do it. We have to do it both, from both sides, in order to be successful. So it is really reasonable for me to ask and to kind of go to the UN and say, you have to do that. You know, your habitat conferences, this is simply not enough. This was not going to save the planet. We have to do more radical steps, and that has to be on the political side. I can see the university and also kind of, you know, being in universities in Germany, this is on the top of the agenda of almost every kind of, it's not just architects, it's also in many other professions. So it's on top there, and we have to make sure it stays on that priority from all sides.
Yeah, and maybe I'll say something because I'm an outsider to architecture, but I am in an architecture department. And I'm struck by the fact that both the UN and architecture have stakeholders. So this was a very powerful part of the conversation, right? Architects are actually supposed to consult the stakeholders on a site, right? So that's a very powerful step right there in a process of architecture. And there's an anecdote that I love to tell about the hokey experiment that was called Biosphere 2, which was somewhere out in the desert next to Arcosanti, for the architects in the room. And it never occurred to the architects that the concrete was a stakeholder. But in the closed system that they were trying to model as a kind of more than human terrarium with their little plant species and their little, you know, pet animals, it turned out the concrete was biotically active. It turned out the concrete, the cement, was taking oxygen out of the atmosphere, and the humans were, you know, keeling over from oxygen deprivation. So this, for me, is the perfect cautionary tale, right? Concrete and rebar are biotically active. They are participants in a more than human symbiotic relationship. The planet is an active homeostatic system, right? So for me, this is a very direct question to architecture. Who are your stakeholders?
Olafur, Kumi?
Yeah, I think there are good architects and bad architects, a little bit like with artists. Of course, there's only but the thing is evidently that the sensitive balancing of being able to listen to the stakeholders, because I think that typically one can call out the earth on the soil on which you build, the rocks in the soil, the birds on the soil, and the seeds in the soil that the birds are eating, and so on. So a great architect, and I would like to say that as you can hear, it's a great luxury to work with Sebastian here at the studio, which is why we founded the SOS office within my artistic practice, which is called SOE. And the notion is that there are simply projects where the architect is able to amplify the agenda of the context, and then allow and if in this case I could be the context, so I'm the beneficiary, and I hope that what I can bring back to the architect is an amplification of the best version of themselves, you could say. So it's not just like art and architecture, or you could say the architect and the stakeholder. It is the quality of the dynamic sensitivity. And of course, that is a question in the context of what is also called junk space, all the architecture that is just thrown out, 90% covering 90 or 99% of the world. And you know, so we are having a conversation in a small room, in a small part of a huge field. But I gradually see when Sebastian, that's why I'm so interested in architecture, in educational infrastructure, the kind of consequences of building educational infrastructure is so widespread because you have a lot of influence spatially, design-wise, on the sort of, I think I could sort of activities. I don't mean to sound generalizing, but it is in that stage that we can normalize the more than human as your, as your collaborators, not as your enemies. It's not us against the stone. The stone is our friend. It is stoning its own agenda to us to help us. We just don't know how to listen to the stone, which is because we were obsessed with modernity and we were caught in some illusion about the one who has the most when they die is the winner. So this notion of stakeholders, I think it's more about the sort of the resourceful idea of being able to listen and then to kind of give back. And what you give back is a sort of a quantum of agency. It's the ability for the other to speak better. You're hosting the opportunity for one to articulate something they otherwise would not have said. And your contribution was you made the other sound clearer. And that's the kind of relationship with a stakeholder that I think is, how should I say it? It's also very much about, in education, top-down, French academia, Western thinking, knowledge production, you could say, instead of saying our values are really not in how I tell you what to think, it is how I listen to you, to what you want. And this is actually a bigger, and of course a very big problem for art, which to a large extent has a lot of individualism or egoism or subjectivity and so on, because it is a field of that was celebrated for its exceptionalism, but that is a very questionable concept. And working with a team like this, for me as an artist, in the context of your Biennale, which is outside of the Art Biennale, is a great luxury for me, as I find that my better contribution has often been to listen and to understand and learn, and then try to give back at a measure where it is rewarding for the ones who one could call the stakeholders.
Well, following those brilliant comments by Caroline, Sebastian, and Olafur, I'm reminded of a moment during the liberation struggle when you found yourself in a situation like this. You said, most of the really good points I wanted to make have been brilliantly made by the previous speakers. And then you said, however, for emphasis, and then you spoke for about 1 hour. But let me just focus on the question of stakeholdering as a concept. And when we look at what's happening at the human level, we're seeing a massive process of othering, that's happening, the them versus us, in the context of, and we need to name it, in the context as a re-emergence of fascism in a very troubling way. And so so if I can bring an African sort of wisdom into this conversation, there's this notion of Ubuntu, which is a sense of community-centeredness. And the idea in Ubuntu, the sort of one line in Ubuntu that's most powerful, it says, I am because you are. I am because you are. Now, in African culture, where we did not see the massive devastation of all our natural sort of and ecological assets on the same scale that we've seen in other parts of the so-called developed world, still, I am because you are, in terms of who are the voices, who are the stakeholders, was still seen in human terms, primarily. And so I think the challenge of thinking about doing things differently must also not be done in a way we de-historicize how we have landed up in the position that we find ourselves in. And what I mean by that is, if we look at the tragedy of colonialism, colonialism actually was not simply about colonial conquest, economic conquest, and so on, but a big part of it was about cultural hegemony, right? And imposing a very different, sort of way of being. So today, and critical of it, to it, has been the destruction of indigenous knowledge systems. So in the way, and today if we look at where are some of the most valuable ideas are coming in terms of how to think about the climate crisis and where the inspiration is coming, it's coming from those parts of what we could call ancient wisdom, indigenous culture that actually survived the onslaught. And if we look at indigenous peoples who were written off by the colonial project as uncivilized, we actually need to look at what we can learn from them, because that is where you see the greatest wisdom in terms of interdependence, mutual dependency, and so on. So I think this question that Caroline poses about who are the stakeholders when we do anything on the soil that is nature is a difficult, is the question to ask. And we have to be, we almost have to have champions and voices. Obviously, it's not as if, by the way, nature cannot speak. That's the last point I want to make. Often we say nature cannot speak, and that's true. Trees cannot speak, and so on. But obviously, there are advocates and so on, and those voices need to be in our design moving forward. Thank you.
Can I just add to that, staying on the screen for a second, or we're just ready to say something? It's just this creating awareness and this sensitizing of our relationships to the sort of systems. There is the artist, the colleague artist Natasha Myers, who's also an anthropologist out of Toronto. She talks about the vegetalization of our senses, the vegetalization, and so it's very focused on plant-people relationships, and I find it very interesting that the notion of a plural perspective, or another kind of sort of plurality, as Natasha works with, should I say, I wouldn't say mixing, but bringing together indigenous knowledge, wisdom, like you talked about, biology and anthropology, like sciences, as well as dance and movement and art. And I guess that's getting quite close to architecture at some point, because it's like performativity in spatial terms. But she took the word and coined the term, instead of saying Anthropocene, which is very man-specific, she talks about Planthropocene, which has Anthropocene inside of it anyway. So Planthropocene is actually quite nice. And I see a lot of people, which I find inspiring, doing work like her, really trying to question the livable world more fundamentally. So how do we live together? Probably Hashim also starts with the question, whether modern project driven by capitalism, colonialism, supremacy, that modern project, how do we live together? It's probably not bad to consider ending that, basta, over, and then starting a new system in which the ground is fertile for asking, how do we then live together now, where the plants have a vote, if that's the solution, if the plant has a vote too, or if listening to the plant becomes the finest exercise of the day.
I find these comments culminating in a very beautiful way in a certain set of open questions that we're trying to frame within the meetings on architecture here. And I hear, Kumi, when you say nature cannot speak, that this is not a complete sentence, because it says nature cannot speak, but it is imperative upon us to listen, or to figure out ways to listen. And one of the upcoming meetings on architecture is with the Vuslat Foundation, the foundation that Caroline has been working with, on the idea of the space of listening, meaning that architecture has been focused primarily on the voice, on the eye, on the visual space, but we haven't yet given much more attention to the idea that space is there for listening, for being able to engage. And so hopefully that event will open up the discussion about that. I also wanted to point out, thanks for Sebastian to raise that the last meeting on architecture will be titled Looking Forward, and it's about the education of the architect, or the future education of the architect. If I can go backwards, one of the first discussions we had was with Emanuele Coccia, the philosopher who's very interested in plants and trees. And he pulled the rug from underneath us in architecture by saying that the whole idea of indigenous plants is a construct of colonial thinking, where the classification and the idea that things are grounded in this place is very much connected to what Kumi is saying about the need for the colonial thinking, and also Olafur pointed that out, to contain things in order to destroy them. And therefore they had a place-based thinking. He challenged us, actually, the vitality of plants is very much like what you talked about, Caroline, with fungi and algae, is that these are very mobile entities. And in that respect, I also think that in the same way that he challenged us to think about architecture in a non-indigenous way, in a non-grounded way, and architecture has been burdened with this responsibility of place, you all have today challenged us to think outside another dominating principle in thinking about architecture, which is that of the Gestalt. I think Liz was the one who said we cannot think about objects but situations. You're talking about stakeholders rather than singular approaches to form, and we are talking about systems, right? You opened it up by saying it's not complete. It's going to be endlessly as a process, Sebastian. So here we are confronted with another challenge to architecture coming out of this panel. How can we cleanse our thinking, I would say, from the Gestalt? And, or is that the bad guy in the room? Is there something else that we need to worry about? Caroline?
I'd love to respond to that, because Gestalt, before it was of the eye, was of the ear.
Huh.
It was historically, coming out of German aesthetic theory, the fascinating conundrum that you can recognize a tune no matter what key it is in, because you are listening to something other than the frequency of a sound. You are listening to a figure, right? So I think this is a beautiful segue to what I wanted to celebrate in this, you know, this fantastic future assembly, which I only experienced today for a brief moment. Okay, there's a website, there's a virtual thing you can do, but what a soundtrack. I mean, what SOS, what Studio SOS, Olafur, I don't know how much you had to do with it. Sebastian, I don't know how much you, but whoever was working on the soundtrack, it's a beautiful, it's a really compelling part of the experience, just in the brief time I had. And so to this question of listening, listening is a relation, and I think this is where I would come back to Kumi's position on indigenous systems of knowing. At least in North America, you know, we're losing languages at an enormous rate, and they are epistemological relationships to Earth and to natural systems. And so one thing we might pledge ourselves to do as, you know, hegemonic settler colonial peoples in the model of Natasha Myers is to learn more of these indigenous languages. So Robin Wall-Kimmerer, who's a kind of pole star for me, has a whole chapter on the languages of intimacy and animacy, because Potawatomi, which is an Algonquian language, is 70% verbs, where English is like, I don't know, 80% nouns. So right away, this, you know, in the indigenous practices of North America, land is not property, land is relation. And I think this is what we're talking about. So Hashim, you say that architecture is about place, but, you know, for most indigenous peoples, it was about seasonal relationships. It was not, you know, okay, Pache, the Hogan, and the, you know, longhouse. It was also the teepee, and, you know, it was about movable lodgings that were conducted in relation to use patterns that were never permanent or permanently extractive. They had to be negotiated between different language groups through powwows and so on. I don't want to romanticize it. There were wars between Native Americans even before settler colonials, but they had to work out among humans how to be sustainable in their patterns of relations. And I think this is something that architecture could definitely learn without simply extracting indigenous knowledge, which is yet again a problem that we might have. So this question of the Gestalt as a figure of sound, as a modality of listening, and as a place of relation, I think those are all very fruitful.
Kumi, Olafur?
I think I would like to say, Hashim, that I'm not sure whether you know with the layout that we have the pleasure of Mariana that you were looking for a little bit earlier. So perhaps we should step back and let Mariana get to the...
Mariana, very good to see you.
You too. So sorry I'm not there. I was actually there a couple of weeks ago. I forced the whole board of an energy company to do the whole tour of the Biennale. So
Great.
thank you. Very inspirational.
Mariana, you're appearing impromptu, so we'll give you the space for impromptu comments. Jump in.
I mean, it was wonderful to hear what I've heard. I don't know what's been said. And again, apologies, I was in a different event. So just the fact that, you know, this Biennale is happening now during the COVID-19 moment where we've realized just how unprepared we are. You know, we even have these vaccines, but we have vaccine apartheid where 80% of doses are being hoarded by 10% of countries. And the, you know, capacity literally to produce, you know, personal protection equipment wasn't there. It's not that hard to produce it, but we've like lost our ability to make things. And at the same time, we've just had this IPCC report this summer, early August, telling us that there's urgency. You know, we had 8 years left maximum. As Greta Thunberg said when she was 16, you know, what do you do when your house is on fire? You don't sit there and debate, should I stay, should I go? You get the hell out fast. So I just think everything I've just heard is so important, but we also have to ask, what does it mean to have an urgent speed to it all, so that we both plan and think carefully and listen, but also in this moment in history, get our acts together quickly. And I think there's something about unpicking all the different tools we have. You know, just think of governments. That's sort of what I do. I try to help governments work at pace, but on big goals instead of just handing out money, subsidies, guarantees to the incumbents. I think there's something about, you know, bringing a design element to planning. We need to plan for the future, but we need design thinking now to make sure that it is a process that is not linear, it's not static, it's not boring, but precisely embodies what I heard Caroline talking about, which is the power to listen, the power to be empathetic, to put yourself in someone else's shoes. You know, how our governments should be interacting with social movements today, indigenous movements, Fridays for the Future, Black Lives Matter. It's impossible to do that without empathy, and empathy is the art of listening. And I'll just stop at that because I could go on, but I think that kind of, you know, combination of urgency, moving quickly, because we don't have much time. There will probably be other viruses coming about as the permafrost melts and so on, but also to be doing that with an empathetic way that also enables us to work together very, very differently, to collaborate differently. And the whole theme of the Biennale, to live together in a different way. It's just, those two contrasts shouldn't be contrasts. They should be working hand in hand, listening carefully, but moving urgently.
Thanks a lot, Mariana. I wanted to turn just to Kumi and Olafur to see if you wanted to add more comments before we turn to the audience.
Mariana's wonderful comments just provokes me to introduce one word into the conversation that has been missing so much from public policy, from design thinking, and so on. A wisdom actually that came from the feminist movement decades and decades ago. Admittedly, not the most easiest word to say, but a very powerful word, and that is intersectionality. I think that what is critically needed in everything that we do is understanding better the intersections between the different challenges that humanity is seeking to address. And I believe we are all culpable, whether it's government, whether it's business, and even whether it's civil society, right? If you think about how civil society has been structured, you've got the human rights movement, the environment movement, poverty and inequality movement, the peace movement, and so on. And of course, all of these issues are completely connected. So if we are going to get things right moving forward in a time where we are running out of time and where the window of opportunity to make this major structural and systemic changes that are necessary, then we have to embrace the notion of intersectionality with real passion and enthusiasm. Thank you.
Want to add more?
Thank you. No, I think that was excellent. I'm so happy just to sit next to Kumi, so I think that says it all.
The feeling's mutual.
I do want to open it to the public, but I do want to come back to say what next for the Future Assembly. So prepare yourselves for this question, everybody. What's next for the Future Assembly as a concept, as a group, as an exhibition? But let me, before I ask this question, turn to the audience. If I understand correctly, there will be a microphone moving around. All you have to do is raise your hand, and we will be able to bring the microphone to you. My problem is the lights are glaring, and I can't see you all very well. But I will need the help of Stefania. Much better.
My name is Jacob Tennant. I'm an architecture student. I was curious to the panelists. I saw the exhibit and enjoyed it. But I was curious about the irony that was sort of alluded to earlier by one of the speakers. How do you reconcile the irony of communicating this thesis in our English language, let alone any human language, and the thesis itself being about alternate stakeholders? Because as I see it, you have to imply some sort of personality into these stakeholders yourselves, and maybe in this case it's for the sake of teaching people or showing people something. But in the so-called real world, when you interact with stakeholders, there's other interests at play, and I'm just wondering how you reconcile those things and how you parse them out and how you chose to embody the stakeholders the way you did.
Maybe I can answer that. I think we picked up on that problem in the discussion. It's about communication, and during the process we learned a lot that somehow it might not be a problem for a bird to, or for a tree to talk to another tree. It might not be a problem to actually have kind of animals and a kind of whole ecosystem kind of, living in a certain sync, which means they are in a dialogue, they understand each other. And this is somehow the point in the design process. It was the point that I realized, actually, I'm the only one not understanding what's going on. So, and me as a human being. So we actually lost that ability to understand and to do that. And of course, this exhibition here, first of all, it's an art exhibition. It's about architecture, and it's about engaging the visitors of the Biennale. So we try to implement this element of, slightly being alienated. This is, so you can also see it in the way the timeline is kind of put on the wall. This is actually, it goes a bit into details, but it's actually picking up on the idea of how animals kind of do their camouflage on the fur or on leaves. So it's actually a camouflage pattern, which is a natural pattern that helps us to organize the timeline on the wall. It's not in a grid, or it's not in a kind of systemized way. It's done in a way as, let's say, nature would have done it. But what we wanted to do with the exhibition is, first of all, catch the visitors on the Biennale and kind of bring them into the topic. But in every aspect of the design, the carpet, for example, we try to acknowledge the fact that, of course, there's this irony, and this is actually spot on. We should have done the same for kind of, for non-humans, for people who are actually not able to come to Venice and not able to kind of walk on 2 feet, but still, understand that there's an ambition, there's an agenda slowly picking up amongst humanity to actually come up with better solutions in the future. So this irony should be part of the experience in that show.
Can I add to that? The process of working, as Sebastian said, also brought up questions of being mindful for what it is we want to or for the space we want to arrive at, but we can't imagine it. But we can still exercise a degree of mindfulness or mentalization of something that is hard to imagine. And throughout the design process, some of us actually met in Iceland, partly because of a different project. It was with Mary Robinson. There was a vote in Iceland on legislation on environment, and Kumi was there as well. And we went to the funeral of a glacier. It was called OK. And there was another group there who we got to know and ended up celebrating or the funeral with, if you can say that. Nevertheless, we went to the funeral, and on the place where this old glacier had been for many, many years, there was a rock, and on the rock there was a little sign. And the sign says, there was a glacier, died so and so, and then. We know why it's the cause of death, humans, and so on. So it says, one thing at the end, it's very beautiful. It says, we know how to solve the problem, but only you who will see this sign in the future will know whether we did it. And it allows us a kind of tool from where we can look back at ourselves, which is nothing new. It's like, it's not even hard. Imagine that you are 100 years from now and you're looking back at where we are sitting now in this cinema in Venice, online, some of us. What would you tell yourself? Would you just write yourself a letter? Because then it turns out you actually do know a lot more how to listen to a tree, for instance. It's actually not so hard, because it's also quite obvious if you pay attention what the tree wants. It wants water. It wants to tree. It is treeing through its day. It has lots of relationships, some of us, many of which are inaccessible to us through the roots, through weather and seasons and so on and so forth. This is not so hard. To sort of put yourself in the place of a tree turns out to be rather easy, and therefore it's also quite easy to see, oh, this tree is not doing well. It must be uncomfortable. What could I do to assist my friend, the tree? So as much as there is an element of blindness, and we just have to kind of set some goals, even though that might be the process itself, once you actually arrive to actually think about, well, what does the ocean want? It's very clear. There's no doubt at all what the ocean wants. It wants to be clear and have its life and be a part of a global ecosystem. And in that sense, it somehow had this incredible abstraction and very high degree of rationalism, or something very pragmatic, and not so much in the middle, which is why one could say it's not necessarily about design in that sense, but it's also about the distance between the vision and the pragmatics, even though both of them are right in front of us. It seems so alien.
Yeah, and I just wanted to throw in the word translation. So we are at an extraordinary point in earth sciences. We're at an extraordinary point in biology where we have data now about, a Swedish forest that is exuding volatile chemicals between the trees and among the trees. We don't know what it means yet, right? So the irony of speaking for, right, the more than human is, of course, very arrogant, and we have to be quite restrained about that. But it's also the only tool we have. And it's a tool that science has struggled with for a long time. So I think if you're interested in this question, you could go back to Jakob von Uxel, who is this marvelous Baltic German theoretical biologist. And in the 30s, he comes up with this idea of the Umwelt of every creature, which has its own biosemiotic system. But then he tells you the tick is a highwaywoman, and she's waiting to pounce, right? So he's using a completely human metaphor and analogy for an alien arachnid who sees with her entire exoskeleton, who smells, with the hairs on the outside of her body, and who is triggered to jump on you by the heat that you give off when you're walking by her, right? None of these communicative systems are human. Like we actually don't communicate in any of these registers, at least on a conscious level. But with the aid of his translations, we can actually enter this world of a tick, and we can have a kind of mingled horror and admiration for the functional cycle, as he called it, of that tick. So our tools of translation are very powerful and very beautiful, and I think what's wonderful to celebrate now is that we can sonify data, we can go into registers that humans can't even hear, and then transduce it down to our level of hearing, right? So we have amazing tools to bring these communicative signals into human awareness. And I mean, I'm a utopian. I think the art world is a way that we can bring ourselves to these kinds of awarenesses and can then change ourselves in response.
Just very short anecdotally, Jakob von Oechsel with his Umwelt also very much tried to find out how do animals see. And he has a wonderful set of drawings trying to depict a dog, a bird, a fish, different ways. And those we used in another exhibition at the Biennale Foundation called Life, only recently without this set of amazing stakeholders. We asked a dog and a bird to document the exhibition. So we mounted a camera using Jakob von Oechsel's color scheme, and the dog ran through. Well, imagine if it ran through the Biennale. Of course, it sort of stopped here and there, jumped into the water when it was not supposed to, but we just let it do evidently what it was. It was dogging around, claiming its own way of documenting. And the film is really frustrating, hard to watch, but that's how it is. And we are, of course, here I'm also exercising my artistic freedom, but I said to the museum, this is how we are going to document the show. You will only have this film from it.
Thanks a lot, Olafur. Any other questions from the audience?
Yes, thank you very much. I'm Thijs, I'm an illustrator. I love telling stories, and I've always been fascinated about language. And now comes, you were also talking about the languages we created might not be enough to describe the complexity of the changes we are seeing in nature, and also a little bit of the duplicity that we have. Okay, we are talking in English, and when you're looking at the scientific field as well, most research papers are translated into English. So even if you have found a certain finding in your native language, you have this translative issue, even amongst us humans. So I was wondering, because you're also mentioning indigenous communities, what communities we could directly learn from that have found certain ways of expressing these processes in nature. I was just wondering. Thank you.
Yes, I think it was really a vital discussion in designing the process, and to imagine for us as the designers, how could there be a dialogue between the stakeholders. And we learned that there are many people, many indigenous cultures who actually have a very good knowledge about their immediate surrounding, their environment they are actually living in, and they actually train that every day. And it's really by being in that environment, you keep that knowledge alive and you transport it to the next generation. And it is very difficult with our Western understanding to actually capture that knowledge and kind of contain it somewhere, because the container is actually the forest or the environment in which the cultures actually live. So there's an inseparable connection between the language and the place where you live, and also the tools that you use to kind of communicate outside your own species. That is really a local thing. So in order to answer that question about language, I think it is essential to really not have English as the only language to kind of transport knowledge is the first thing, because there are like so many languages on the world, many of them dying. So it is important to kind of, save that languages, but to even extend and to also save as much of the indigenous knowledge that we have to find ways of, somehow containing that. And I think there are lots of people working on that. On the timeline, there's a small part from Olafur Behmann, who's working on the indigenous university in Ecuador, I think. It's an amazing project because it's really thinking about how can you, as somebody from the outside, from the Western world, somehow assist or help for that indigenous cultures to kind of keep their knowledge or get back their knowledge also. And this is, of course, a completely different way of studying, a completely different way of kind of handing knowledge over to the next generation. And there's a lot to learn from us. So to only concentrate on one language, on English as a kind of global language, is simply not enough, by far not enough.
Yeah, and I'm just going to go to a feel-bad moment, okay? A week ago, I ran a workshop on symbiosis, reciprocity, and indigenous epistemologies, and had some very privileged conversations with indigenous language speakers, but 2 indigenous representatives had their languages eradicated in the US and Canadian systems of re-education. So I began to realize in that workshop that genocide is ecocide, that when colonial cultures try to eradicate a language and a people, they are also eradicating a relation to environment. This is a very dark thought, but we have to own it. We have to sit with it, just as we have to sit with the trouble, as Donna Haraway says. Now, the hope is that sometimes these languages can be reassembled. And again, we come back to the idea of the future assembly. It simply must be the case that indigenous peoples, to the extent that they can be intact, have a seat at this table. And here is where, Hashim, your opening comment about the problem with nations, is very pertinent. When Venice was a maritime empire, the nation was a language group that might have a neighborhood, the Jewish sestiere, the Hansa sestiere, right? Nations have now been codified and hardened as states with militaries, right? There's a joke that a language is, it's like a dialect with an army, right? So all of these are connected. Languages, indigenous thought systems, relationships to the ecology. So yeah, little feel bad moment, but we're here to propose a future that will be different.
May I add just one thing? This is Liz, disembodied Liz.
We hear you, but we cannot see you. Okay, here we go.
That's okay. Just to be concrete, on the project website, there is a contribution button, which I implore people to take advantage of and to add any suggestions of stakeholders or topics around indigenous knowledges and languages, because it's sincere when we say it's really an unfinished, ever-growing, kind of incomplete project, and part of doing it well is keeping this criticality active while not falling into cynicism about it. Staying with the trouble, as Caroline said. So please contribute if you have suggestions.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Liz. While you look for somebody to answer another question, Hashim, I can maybe also just make a short addition on the question of languages. Actually, thanks to Liz, who was just talking, I became acquainted with the work of what is his name? Let me see. I wrote it down here. The people who worked with this idea of decolonizing epistemology and to somehow recognize the structure of epistemology to the extent it was defined by military, or was defined by economical collaborations, or was defined by nation-state formations. And of course, it goes well beyond that. but the way that language also changes and structures and so on. And in that journey, it meant a lot of binary exclusion and reduction and essentially eradication of other languages as being, how should I say, I wouldn't call it threats, but opposites somehow. And I hope that with the recognition of our own language's limitations and these structural issues and the need for a diversified pool of languages, or a world of worlds, as the Zapatistas would say, this notion of how do we actually allow for a language that we do not understand to coexist with us. There was a philosopher, a Nigerian philosopher residing out of India, Boyo Akomolafe, who has sort of left this whole narrative of what defines the West and then all the discourses around it. The Western one is just one of many worlds, and maybe to begin with in terms of how to better appreciate, understand, or at least acknowledge and accept the plurality of languages, probably we can start by decentralizing ourselves and the privilege of always referring, as epistemology has it, to where we are and how we are on a project, leaving alternative models aside. Let me just be a little organized here and say that what happened to my two, one is Mignolo and Escobar, I think. Is that the names of them? Colonial theorists who work so much about how to decolonize languages and how to sort of reassemble the plurality and the shared, this idea, a world of worlds. I think it's Mignolo who worked on the Zapatistas on the side of sharing languages.
More question from the audience. Thanks a lot, Olafur. One more question from the audience, and then we wrap up. If there's none, we can wrap up directly. One more. Okay. Fantastic.
Yeah, thank you for this very inspiring exchange. I'm Rosanne. I work as an artist, and with these topics, including the multi-species community, and also making our public more aware of how we can be adaptive as humans towards the landscape, instead of always changing the landscape to what we think are our needs. But what we often come across in our work, and what I still also, we change our thinking or behavior in how we bring in the non-human stakeholders, but I still keep on thinking a lot about alternative economy, and I was wondering if some of you could also elaborate a bit on the economy aspect, and how, if we question how will we live together in the future, I think different value systems are a super important aspect of that as well, next to looking different at our environment. And as we still notice how our landscape is we monetize it. So I was curious about your thoughts on that.
Thanks. We do have an economist in the house, if Mariana is still around. I don't know. Mariana, are you there?
I'm here. So, thanks for the question, actually, because I was just thinking that it would be good to talk about that, and you framed it really well. I was actually going to push back a bit on what Olafur said, because I don't think the problem is, that we need to become less economistic. We just need a very different way to think about the economy. And this is why, even with the World Health Organization that I mentioned before, what we've been trying to do is reverse the logic. Instead of, at best saying invest in healthcare and health systems because it's good for the economy, we should be saying invest in health for all, for everybody, because it's good in and of itself. And then you backtrack and ask, how do we actually deliver that in terms of the economic structures we have? How can we have outcomes-oriented budgeting, like we do, by the way, when we go to war? No one just puts money here and there and then hopes to win the war. It's outcomes-oriented, but we don't do it with our social problems. What does it mean for procurement, for the governance of intellectual property rights, right? So to be really goal-oriented, and that requires really debunking a lot of the narrative and the storytelling, the discourse about the economy. Where is value created in the economy? The current traditional way to think about it is that value is created in business, and there's markets out there, and sometimes they screw up, so market failures, and then we need to come in and pick up the mess. So even clean water is seen as a market failure that someone has to then come in and put a bandage on it. The lack of enough basic R&D, it's seen as a positive externality, put a bandage on it. Pollution, a negative externality, put a bandage on it. So this is all a narrative and a story in the economy that the markets are the best way to organize a system. They screw up every now and we need to then fix market failures. So a very different narrative and story is actually about co-creation, co-shaping of the economy, as opposed to thinking that wealth is created in one place and other actors just have to pick up the mess and at best redistribute the value that is created there. So notions of, for example, pre-distribution, not redistribution, are required to actually get the conditions right in the first place, collectively shaping the economy towards goals, precisely so you don't have to waste so much money later picking up the mess. And I'm sure that Hashim wants to close the session now, so I could go on, but I think your question is central also, so we don't say things like, oh, we need less economists. We need a fundamentally different type of economic thinking and better economics.
Mariana, I'm going to close by turning the question around from economy to politics and policy. And by turning to ask all of you, what is the future of the Future Assembly? You are a very strong advocate of the role that the nation state could still play in the future economies. And yet the Future Assembly does put on the table and around the table entities that have to transcend the nation state in order to exist. Isabel Stengers, more than 10 years ago, said that the only politics left in front of us is cosmopolitics. So how are we able to take the Future Assembly that you've put in front of us as a beautiful challenge and proposition and take it to the next step when the United Nations itself and world economies are structured around national interest and national politics, and where problems like the pandemic we faced confront the reality of nation states and national borders at the time when our big problems and challenges and those entities that the contributors have beautifully proposed transcend those boundaries, actually require that we transcend those boundaries in order for us to continue to live. And I ask this question not kind of in an open-ended way, but in a manner that you did, Mariana, by saying, we need action now. Kumi said, we need action now. So how do we start with the action in order to get to the hope? When the action is confined by the present assembly, not the future assembly.
Can I say something immediately? I think the future assembly now, as it here, it was a 2-year process, and it was on your shoulder and our shoulders, and I really want to thank you, for taking on that. Specifically, as you also mentioned, the soundtrack, I really want to thank all the participants from the Biennale who were part of the Future Assembly. And we haven't really recognized them enough today, I think, but without them, without really the imagination of what this could actually be, and we have really 50 great examples that was just done within the frame of the Biennale, and this was really amazing. So it was an effort of us all to do the Future Assembly as it is, and we are basically looking for, new venues. We are looking for people who really think that is a topic and they want to bring us to the next stage. So I think we are really open for that. But Olafur, you might have to add to that. This was really first to thank you all for making that happen.
It was a nice exercise across silos, how to even and of course only dipping the toe into this notion of plurality. I today had a fly in this room here, and I named it Siegfried, and then a friend came over and he said, is it Siegfried from Wagner? No, I said, it's from Siegfried and Roy. So the kind of time it takes to collaborate and how you sort of find out, oh, this is where we have what we have in common. As your question, Hashim, on the action now, I think the challenge of representational diplomacy and how it infiltrated structural organization of people and dialogues in this defensive term. So everyone comes with a monolithic agenda of their own country, and very little effort is putting into focusing on what do we have in common. That has become the corridor politics, the organization by all the lobbyists around it. So the General Assembly as a form has lost its ecstasy and it's become static. So it is not ecstatic, and that is what we're trying to bring back in, the ecstaticism. This is a Olafur quote. I'm so excited to use him, and I just want to thank him. But the world has become static, and this notion of unstaticness or ecstaticness is obviously something that I, in the gratitude of having been a part of this, and being with great people from whom I've learned a lot, like my own team, Liz and Sebastian here, but also everyone else and the Biennale people, and the willingness with everyone contributing not to make it static, but to make it ecstatic. And that's a nice little exercise for going on to the next level and moving it on and taking it as essentially also talking to the UN, should they have time. So change is, I think, done in that way, by doing. It's not done by thinking. And that was it was a lot more doing than it maybe looks like, because it has a speculative element, but also speculative doing has feet on the ground.
I just wanted to lift up what Liz said when we think about the future. I think the spirit of what she said showed we need humility, we need openness, we need to have, as we think about whatever we do in the future generally, and what we do with the Future Assembly specifically, I think that is the kind of approach that we need. We also need an approach of humility, to be less arrogant as a species, that we are the holders of absolute knowledge and absolute wisdom. Clearly we are not, otherwise we wouldn't have made such a mess of things given where we are. And I think that part of the way we think about moving things forward, we need to, for example, not make the same mistake we made after the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009, as we hopefully get to a point in the not too distant future when we are in a genuinely post-COVID moment, when we address the vaccine apartheid situation that we have, right? But if you look at what happened after the global financial crisis, which was an opportunity for us as a species to look at ourselves and see how bankrupt we had become, right? The approach was system recovery, system maintenance, and system protection. What was needed then and what is urgently needed now is a spirit of system innovation, system redesign, and system transformation. And whatever we do with the Future Assembly going forward, I think that needs to be imbued in it. The other issue on language and communication, I think, again, gratitude to Liz for actually lifting that up, because I think this is the biggest problem we have in all our struggles to shift things around. And I think, as has been noted by others before me, that I think one of the mistakes we make in understanding how political power operates is we think that that is exercised mainly through the deployment of what you could call what others have called the repressive state apparatus, army, police, formal laws, and so on. But actually, the more insidious and more powerful form of control is not the repressive state apparatus, but it's the ideological state apparatus, which is the framework for education, the framework for religion, the framework for arts and culture, the norms, what norms and social norms and customs that are adhered to, and most critically is the framework for communications and media, which is why we've seen certain fascist-like and fascist-leaning politicians elected from India to the US to Brazil. So I think to counteract that, I think on this question of language, I just want to naively say that the best language that we can use moving forward is the language of music, the language of arts and culture, the language that people who are not literate can be able to engage with it. And so I think as we think about anything we do with regard to the Future Assembly going forward, I think we should challenge ourselves to think about how do we broaden access of this conversation to as many people who really need to be part of the conversation, and stretch our imaginations about and our talents and capabilities of how can we communicate what we are communicating to the largest possible audience. Because if we don't do that, we don't get the critical mass to push our governments and push our business leaders to move with the urgency that it's required. I just wanted to end with these words, which I was just thinking, which needs to be part of the Future Assembly communication, which is the power, the human power to be destructive does not even come close to matching the resilience capability of nature. And for us as a species, humans, I think if we were to develop the capability to coexist with nature in a mutually dependent relationship that allows human survival to go on for centuries and centuries, if we get that right, perhaps, just perhaps, human beings will end up treating each other with greater solidarity, with greater humanity, and with greater compassion. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Mariana, you're getting applause from the room here. Mariana?
Sorry, I was clapping. I wasn't raising my hand. No, I mean, just your provocation, Hashim, about the nation state. I don't think it is about nation states. It's about new ways to collaborate. It's how to foster collective intelligence, which, by the way, is the word that Dr. Tedros is using for the vaccine apartheid. You know, the kind of rent-seeking that we have, the way we have chosen to govern the international health system is allowing a lot of value extraction and not value creation in terms of also how we share in the rewards. So these new governance structures that we need within states, between states, but especially between public and private and third sector and citizen groups, those are all outcomes of how we decide to govern. There's so many, you know, there's a whole concept in some of the economic literature on varieties of capitalism. There's not one way to do capitalism. And the economy itself and markets are outcomes of how we do it. There's no market pressures out there forcing companies, for example, to engage in $4 trillion of share buybacks, which is what they've done. You know, just buying back your own shares to boost stock prices, stock options, and executive pay. This is a financialized form of capitalism, which is on the back of very, very specific decisions that were made in the 1980s in terms of ideas on how to govern the corporation, but also the deregulation of the standard, you know, the SEC, the SEC in the US, which then allowed practices like that, which used to be illegal, but also within governments, everything that I talk about is we need new governance structures. So instead of going back to the old ideas of is it state, is it business, is it nation states, is it, you know, global organizations, bringing it down to the nitty-gritty and redesigning the actual governance structures within all these organizations with really practical tools and metrics around notions of the common good, just like the BBC has the notion of public value in terms of how it's governed. It's a very ambitious concept, by the way, and it's a design concept. We don't have deep conversations about public value or the common good within our public organizations, so they become part of the problem. And I do think that, you know, that these are the big questions of our time, and we need to move beyond the ideology that even we ourselves sometimes are captured by when we go back to the old concepts of business, state, nation state. We have to get our hands dirty on changing completely the governance structures around concepts of the common good. And there's the best place to begin this today is with the vaccine.
Thanks a lot, Mariana. There's Liz still online. Does Liz have
Yes. Yes, I am.
to add to our discussion before we close?
I would just say, yeah, I'm not sure. I had a note a while ago about also considering temporalities when considering all these ways of engaging with the more than human and including non-humans, and that it's not just about space and matter, but also occupying time differently, thinking time differently, and I think that is an important element of what it means to continue this project, moving forward with design and these kinds of conversations. But that is a bit of an older comment.
Thank you very much. Carla?
Thank you for coming.
Okay. Well, indeed, thank you for coming. And I just urge the Future Assembly group, both SOS and the Design 6, if I can call you that, and to take this on the road. I don't think this is the end of the Future Assembly. This is just the beginning.
Take it to the UN.
And maybe to start even imagining how you design the seats around the table of the Future Assembly. Or maybe it's not a table, maybe it's not seats, but some other format of assembling for those other entities to exist, systems and otherwise, to coexist around this table. And what does a world of world look like? Please don't stop here. I really urge you that. And for the audience, in the meantime, please press Liz's contribution button if you have any ideas. I am happy to announce that this discussion will continue in the coming meetings, one end of October on spaces of listening, one in mid-November, November 14, 15, on sustainability and architecture, where we're happy to share with you that Amina Mohammed has agreed to give the keynote. And the final discussion, as I mentioned earlier, on the future of architecture education on November 19 and 20. I wanted to thank our panelists, Caroline, Sebastian, Olafur, Kumi, Liz, and Mariana. I wanted to thank those among the SOS team who could not make it, and especially among the Design 6, Mary Robinson, Paula Antonelli, and Hadil Ibrahim for having been the symbiotic person behind all of this. And as Sebastian mentioned, all the participants who contributed to the Future Assembly. Keep those amazing ideas flowing. See you at the next meetings. Peace.